He found her curled like a wounded animal among the hay bales, wearing shame like a second skin and a price tag that made his blood run cold. What Samuel Brooks thought would be just another ordinary morning feeding his livestock became the moment that changed two broken lives forever. The year was 1887, and the Montana Territory was still wild enough that a man could disappear into its vastness and never be found, or never want to be. Samuel Sam Brooks had chosen isolation after losing everything that mattered to him, building his homestead in a valley so remote that visitors came twice a year and winter lasted half of forever. Sam stood 6 feet tall in his worn leather boots, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world and hands calloused from 8 years of working land that demanded everything and gave back just enough to survive. His dark hair had begun showing silver at the temples, premature gray that spoke of nights spent staring at empty beds and mornings that stretched into loneliness. He'd been a Texas Ranger once, back when justice wore a badge and rode a fast horse. But that was before Sarah, before the cabin they'd built together, before the fever that took her and the child she carried in the same cruel week. After burying them both under the big oak tree, Sam had packed what little remained of his heart and headed north, looking for a place where memories couldn't follow. For 8 years, Brooks' homestead had been his sanctuary and his prison. He raised cattle, fixed fences, and lived by the rhythm of seasons that asked nothing of him except survival. The nearest town, Cedar Falls, lay 20 miles south through mountain passes that could kill a man if he traveled them carelessly. Sam made the journey 4 times a year for supplies, spoke to no one more than necessary, and returned to his solitude with the relief of a man who'd forgotten how to trust the world with his heart. But on this particular February morning, as snow fell soft and silent over the Montana peaks, and his breath steamed in the barn's golden shadows, fate was preparing to remind him that some gifts come disguised as broken things seeking shelter. Grace Morgan had been running for 3 days through country that didn't forgive mistakes. She had no way of knowing that the barn she'd stumbled into belonged to a man who understood what it meant to be damaged, or that her desperate search for warmth and safety would heal wounds that 8 years of solitude couldn't touch. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin not with a first glance across a crowded room, but with the sound of desperate breathing in an empty barn and a man brave enough to offer kindness to a stranger who'd been treated like property. The price tag pinned to her collar said $1, but what Sam Brooks was about to discover was that Grace Morgan was worth everything he'd forgotten he still had to give. The morning air bit sharp and clean as Sam Brooks pushed open the barn door, his breath creating small clouds in the February cold. Something felt different. Not wrong exactly, but changed, like when snow falls in the night and the world wakes up wearing a new face. His livestock sensed it too. Bessie, his old milk cow, shifted restlessly in her stall, while the horses nickered with an unease that made Sam's hand drift instinctively toward the rifle slung across his back. That's when he saw her. She was curled against Bessie's flank like a lost child seeking warmth. So still that for a heart-stopping moment, Sam thought he was looking at a corpse. Her clothes were too thin for Montana winter. A faded dress that might have been blue once, covered by a coat 3 sizes too large with buttons missing and sleeves that hung past her fingertips. Dark hair fell across her face in tangled waves, hiding features that exhaustion had carved too sharp. But it was the piece of paper pinned to her collar that made Sam's jaw clench with a fury he hadn't felt since his ranger days. A price tag, crude and ugly, with 1 written in black ink like she was a piece of marked-down merchandise at a general store closing sale. She stirred when his boots crunched on the hay, a barely perceptible movement that told him she was alive but barely awake. Her eyes opened slowly, brown as coffee and dulled by whatever hell she'd escaped from, and fixed on him with the wary alertness of someone who'd learned that survival meant always watching for the next threat. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Sam stood in the doorway, with morning light cutting golden slashes behind him, this stranger studying his face for signs of danger, while he took in the full picture of what desperation looked like when it wore a woman's shape. She was young, maybe 25, but life had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with years. Her cheekbones stood out too sharp, speaking of meals missed and hunger accepted as normal. Her hands, clutched protectively around herself, showed the calluses of hard work, and the careful way she held them suggested injuries that hadn't quite healed. "You hurt?" Sam asked finally, his voice rough from disuse. She flinched at the sound, then shook her head once. Quick, economical, like someone who'd learned that drawing attention was dangerous. Sam crouched down slowly, making himself smaller, less threatening. "You hungry?" This time she hesitated before nodding, and something in that hesitation, the way she seemed to weigh whether admitting need was worth the risk, made Sam's chest tighten with an anger that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with whoever had put that wariness in her eyes. "Coffee's hot in the house," he said simply. "Bread too." She didn't move, just watched him with those coffee-colored eyes that had seen too much. Sam could read the calculation happening behind them. Was this stranger offering genuine help or just another kind of trap? "Name's Samuel Brooks," he continued, settling back on his heels. "Most folks call me Sam. This is my place, my barn, my cow you've been keeping warm." He paused, then added gently, "What do I call you?" Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, hoarse from cold and disuse. "Grace." "Grace." Sam nodded as if the name carried weight. "That's a good name. Suits you better than—" His eyes flicked to the price tag and his voice hardened. "Better than that piece of trash pinned to your coat." Grace's hand moved instinctively to the tag, protective almost, as if removing it might somehow make her situation worse. Sam noticed the movement and filed it away. Whatever had been done to her, the psychological chains were still firmly in place. "You run from someone?" he asked. "Everyone," she whispered, and the word carried such exhaustion that Sam felt something crack open in his chest, a place that had been sealed shut since Sarah died. Sam stood slowly, brushing hay from his knees. "Well, you're safe here. For now, anyway. Come up to the house when you're ready. Door's open." He turned to leave, then paused. "Grace? That tag doesn't mean nothing. Not here. Not to me." He left her there among the hay and the warm animal breath, knowing that pushing would only make her run. Some wounded things had to choose their own healing, and Grace Morgan looked like something that had been broken so thoroughly that trust would have to be rebuilt one careful gesture at a time. 20 minutes later, Sam was frying bacon and brewing coffee when he heard the cabin door creak open. Grace stood in the doorway like a deer ready to bolt, still wearing that oversized coat, still carrying herself like someone expecting a blow. But she'd removed the price tag, and Sam noticed she'd folded it carefully and tucked it into her pocket rather than throwing it away. "Sit anywhere," Sam said without turning around, keeping his voice casual. "Coffee's almost ready." Grace chose the chair closest to the door, escape route secured, and sat with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. She took in the cabin with quick assessing glances. One room with a bed tucked into the corner, a table that had seen better years, a stone fireplace that threw warm light across rough-hewn walls. It was sparse but clean, practical but somehow welcoming. Sam set a cup of coffee in front of her and stepped back, giving her space. The cup was thick ceramic, chipped at the rim but warm, and Grace wrapped her hands around it like it was the most precious thing she'd ever held. "Sugar's on the table," Sam said, returning to the stove. "Milk too, if you want it." Grace sipped the coffee black, closing her eyes as the warmth spread through her. When she opened them again, some of the wariness had softened into something that might eventually become gratitude. Sam placed a plate before her, eggs, bacon, bread still warm from the oven, and settled into the chair across from her with his own breakfast. He ate without staring at her, giving Grace the privacy to be hungry without shame. She ate carefully at first, small bites as if testing whether the food was real or might be snatched away. But hunger won out over caution, and soon she was eating with the focused intensity of someone who'd gone too long without enough. "Where you headed?" Sam asked when she'd slowed down. Grace paused with her fork halfway to her mouth. "Nowhere particular, just away." "Away's a big place," Sam observed. "Lots of country between here and there." She almost smiled at that, just a tiny quirk at the corner of her mouth that transformed her face completely. For just a moment, Sam glimpsed what Grace Morgan might look like when she wasn't running from demons. I didn't mean to trespass, she said quietly. I was just so cold, and your barn. Barns for the living, Sam interrupted. And you are. They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, the fire crackling and the morning light growing stronger outside the windows. When Grace set down her fork, she looked around the cabin again, this time with something like curiosity instead of fear. You live here alone, she asked. 8 years now, Sam confirmed. Suits me well enough. Grace nodded as if she understood the appeal of solitude. It feels peaceful. Most days. Sam stood and began clearing the plates. Storm's coming in tonight. You're welcome to stay till it passes. Grace's hand tightened on her coffee cup. I don't have any money. Didn't ask for any. Then what do you want? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with whatever ugly experiences had taught Grace that kindness always came with a price. Sam looked at her directly, his gray eyes steady and honest. Nothing you're not willing to give, he said simply. A woman's got the right to shelter from a storm. That's all this is. Grace studied his face for a long moment, searching for deception or hidden intent. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded once, quick and decisive. Thank you, she whispered. Sam returned to washing dishes, but he was acutely aware of Grace sitting at his table, warming her hands on his coffee, slowly beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where she could stop running long enough to catch her breath. Neither of them knew that the storm approaching from the north would last 3 days, or that by the time it passed, Grace Morgan would have begun to remember what it felt like to be treated like a human being instead of property. Sometimes salvation comes not with trumpets and angels, but with bacon frying in a cast-iron skillet and a lonely man who'd forgotten he still had room in his heart for someone else's pain. The storm hit that evening with the fury of something that had been building strength for 1,000 miles. Wind screamed down from the mountains and threw snow against the cabin windows like handfuls of angry stars. Inside, the fire burned bright and steady, while Grace and Sam found themselves trapped together in the kind of isolation that either breaks people apart or binds them closer. Grace had insisted on sleeping by the fire rather than taking the bed, curling up on Sam's extra blankets with the fierce independence of someone who'd learned not to accept more kindness than absolutely necessary. But when Sam woke to check the fire around midnight, he found her sitting upright, staring into the flames with eyes that held too much darkness for sleep. Can't rest? He asked quietly, settling into his chair without making her explain. Grace shook her head. Too quiet. I keep waiting for... She trailed off, but Sam could fill in the blanks. She was waiting for footsteps, for doors kicked open, for whatever had put that permanent tension in her shoulders. Takes time to learn how to trust quiet, Sam said. When I first came here, I'd wake up every hour checking locks that didn't need checking. What were you running from? Sam poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. Ghosts mostly, memories that followed me everywhere I went. He glanced at her. You? Grace pulled the blanket tighter around herself. Men who thought they owned me. The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding. Sam had seen enough evil in his ranger days to know what kind of men she meant. The kind who looked at women and saw property instead of people. They don't own you now, he said quietly. I know, Grace replied, but her voice held doubt. Sometimes I still feel like I'm wearing their chains, even when I can't see them. They sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the fire burn down to coals while the storm raged outside. When Grace finally fell asleep, she did so gradually, her breathing evening out as trust slowly overcame vigilance. The next morning brought 3 feet of fresh snow and the kind of crystalline beauty that made the world look reborn. Grace woke to the smell of coffee and flapjacks, and for a moment, in that drowsy space between sleep and waking, she forgot to be afraid. Morning, Sam said from the stove, not turning around. Coffee's hot. Grace sat up, automatically smoothing her hair and trying to make herself presentable with the unconscious gestures of someone who'd been trained to always look ready for inspection. Sam noticed but didn't comment, just poured her coffee and set it where she could reach it. Storm's got us snowed in pretty good, he said conversationally. Probably be another day or two before the pass clears enough for travel. Grace nodded and Sam caught something that might have been relief flickering across her face. Being trapped meant she couldn't leave, but it also meant no one could get to her. After breakfast, Sam began the daily routine of winter ranching, checking on livestock, splitting wood, maintaining equipment. Grace watched from the cabin window as he moved through his chores with the steady competence of a man who'd made peace with solitude. When he came back inside, stamping snow from his boots, she had cleaned the breakfast dishes and was standing uncertainly in the middle of the room, as if unsure whether she had the right to make herself useful. "I could help," she offered hesitantly. "I know how to cook, clean, mend things. I don't like being useless." Sam hung his coat on its peg and studied her face. "You're not useless, Grace. You're healing. But if working helps you feel better, I won't stop you." Grace nodded gratefully and immediately began organizing his bachelor chaos with the efficiency of someone who found comfort in creating order from mess. She mended tears in his shirts with stitches so neat they looked professional, reorganized his pantry supplies, and somehow made the sparse cabin feel more like a home than a shelter. Sam watched her work and saw something beyond mere gratitude or the need to earn her keep. Grace moved through domestic tasks with the focused intensity of someone rebuilding her sense of self, one small accomplishment at a time. Every folded shirt, every swept floor, every perfectly prepared meal was proof that she existed, that she had value beyond what others had tried to reduce her to. On the second day of the storm, Sam found Grace standing at the window staring out at the endless white landscape with an expression of wonder on her face. "Never seen snow like this," she said softly. "Where I came from, winter was just cold rain and mud." "Where was that?" Sam asked, settling into his chair with the piece of harness he was repairing. "Texas, mostly. Sometime in New Mexico." Grace's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to reveal too much about herself. "Moved around a lot." Sam nodded, understanding that moved around probably meant was moved around by people who didn't ask her opinion. "This country's hard," he said, "but it's honest. Doesn't pretend to be something it's not." Grace turned from the window. "Is that why you came here?" "Part of it." Sam's hand stilled on the leather. "Lost my wife and baby to fever back in Texas. Felt like everything I looked at reminded me of what was gone. Figured maybe if I went somewhere new, the pain might not follow." "Did it work?" Sam considered the question honestly. "Pain followed, but it changed shape. Got quieter, less sharp." He looked up at her. "What about you? What made you run?" Grace was quiet for so long that Sam thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I was sold when I was 15. My father owed money to the wrong people, and they took me instead of payment." She touched the pocket where she'd put the price tag. "I've been sold 4 times since then, each time thinking maybe the next place would be better, each time learning that men who buy women don't see them as human." Sam's hands clenched on the harness, leather creaking under the pressure. "How'd you get away?" "The last one, Blackwood, got drunk and forgot to lock the door. I ran." Grace's smile was bitter. "Been running for 3 weeks when I found your barn." Sam set down his work and looked at her directly. "Grace, listen to me. What those men did, that wasn't about your worth. That was about their sickness. You understand that?" Grace's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Sometimes I forget that I'm supposed to be a person instead of a thing." "You're a person," Sam said firmly. "You're Grace Morgan, and you're sitting in my cabin drinking my coffee because you chose to trust me enough to stay. That's not something a thing does. That's what a brave woman does." That night, Grace slept deeper than she had in months, and when Sam woke to check the fire, she was still curled peacefully in her blankets, breathing steady and easy like someone who'd finally found a place where nightmares couldn't reach. The storm was beginning to weaken, but something stronger was building between them. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. 2 damaged souls who'd found in each other the possibility that broken things could still be beautiful, still be whole. On the 3rd morning, Grace woke before Sam and started breakfast, humming softly under her breath as she worked. It was the first time he'd heard her make music, and the sound filled the cabin with something it had been missing for 8 long years. The storm was ending, but Grace Morgan was just beginning to remember who she'd been before the world tried to break her. And Sam Brooks was starting to understand that healing wasn't something you did alone. Sometimes it was something you did together, one quiet morning at a time. When the storm finally broke on the fourth day, it left behind a world transformed. Snow lay thick and pristine across the valley, broken only by Sam's careful path to the barn and the delicate tracks of winter creatures testing the new landscape. Grace stood on the cabin's small porch, breathing air so clean and cold it made her lungs ache with possibility. "We'll need supplies from town soon," Sam said, joining her with 2 cups of coffee steaming in the morning air. "Sugar's running low and we're almost out of lamp oil." Grace accepted the coffee gratefully, but something in her posture shifted at the mention of town. The relaxed woman who'd been humming over breakfast became guarded again, shoulders rising with tension. "How far is it?" she asked carefully. "Cedar Falls? About 20 miles south. Road's probably passable now that the wind's died down." Sam studied her face. "You don't have to come. Could leave you here with the rifle if you'd rather." Grace considered this, weighing the fear of being alone against the terror of being seen. After 4 days of safety, the outside world felt impossibly dangerous, full of people who might recognize her, might report back to those still hunting her. "I think I'd like to come," she said finally. "Hiding forever isn't living." Sam nodded approvingly. "We'll take it slow. Cedar Falls isn't much more than a wide spot in the road, but folks there mind their own business mostly." 2 hours later, they were traveling south in Sam's sturdy wagon. Grace bundled in blankets beside him, while the horses picked their way carefully along the snowpacked trail. She wore one of Sam's old coats over her dress, still too large but warm and clean, and had braided her hair back in a style that spoke of quiet dignity rather than desperate concealment. Cedar Falls proved to be exactly what Sam had promised, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single main street with smoke rising from chimneys and the comfortable bustle of people going about their winter business. The general store sat at the heart of town like a friendly beacon, its windows glowing warm against the snow. Grace stayed close to Sam as they entered, hyper-aware of every glance, every whispered conversation that might be about her. But the townspeople seemed more interested in the storm's aftermath than in strangers, and gradually Grace's shoulders began to relax. "Sam Brooks," called the storekeeper, a round man with kind eyes and flour dusting his apron. "Haven't seen you since before Christmas. Storm catch you good?" "Good enough, Henry," Sam replied, setting their supply list on the counter. "This is Grace Morgan. She's staying out at my place." Henry nodded politely to Grace, his curiosity evident but restrained. "Miss Morgan, welcome to Cedar Falls. Hope Sam's been treating you decent." "Very decent," Grace said quietly, surprised by how natural the words felt. As Henry gathered their supplies, other customers drifted in and out of the store. Most nodded respectfully to Sam and smiled tentatively at Grace, the kind of cautious friendliness that small towns showed strangers who came with local endorsement. But not everyone was so welcoming. Victoria Sterling swept into the store like a force of nature, dressed in expensive wool and righteous indignation. She was perhaps 50, with steel gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd appointed herself the moral guardian of Cedar Falls, her eyes fixed immediately on Grace with the predatory instinct of a gossip-scenting scandal. "Well, well," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly across the store. "Sam Brooks with a lady friend. How unexpected." Sam's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "Victoria, how's the Reverend? Busy ministering to those who need spiritual guidance?" Victoria replied, her gaze never leaving Grace. "And you are?" "Grace Morgan," Grace said, lifting her chin with quiet dignity. "Morgan." Victoria repeated the name, as if testing it for lies. "From where, dear?" "Texas originally," Grace replied truthfully. "How nice. And what brings you to our little community?" The question hung in the air like a trap waiting to be sprung. Grace could feel every ear in the store straining to hear her answer, could sense the calculation behind Victoria's seemingly innocent inquiry. "Bad weather," Sam interjected smoothly. "Miss Morgan was caught in the storm. Good thing she found shelter when she did." Victoria's smile sharpened. "Oh yes, the storm. How fortunate that she found her way to your isolated ranch, Sam. Such a coincidence." The implication was clear, and Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. But before she could respond, Sheriff William Hart entered the store, bringing with him the kind of calm authority that made troublemakers reconsider their choices. "Morning, folks," Hart said pleasantly. He was perhaps 60, with the weathered face of a man who'd seen enough of life to judge it fairly. "Victoria, I hope you're not interrogating our visitors. Bad for tourism." Victoria bristled. "I was simply making conversation, Sheriff." "I'm sure you were." Hart tipped his hat to Grace. "Miss Morgan, I presume. Welcome to Cedar Falls. Hope our weather hasn't put you off mountain living entirely." "Not at all, Sheriff," Grace replied. "It's beautiful country." "That it is." Hart's eyes held warmth and a shrewdness that missed nothing. "Sam's place is one of the finest homesteads in the territory. Lucky thing you found shelter there." As they completed their business and prepared to leave, Victoria made one final attempt to stir trouble. "I do hope you'll be joining us for Sunday service, Miss Morgan," she said sweetly. "The Reverend gives such inspiring sermons about redemption and proper behavior." Grace met her gaze steadily. "I'd like that, Mrs. Sterling. I've always believed that everyone deserves the chance to be better than their past." Victoria's smile faltered slightly at the unexpected response, and Sam had to hide his own smile as they loaded their supplies into the wagon. As they drove out of town, Grace was quiet for a long time, processing the encounter. Finally, she spoke. "She knows something's not right about me." "Victoria Sterling sees sin in sunshine and scandal in snowflakes," Sam replied. "Don't let her poison your peace." "But what if she's right? What if people can tell just by looking at me what I've been?" Sam pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her fully. "Grace, listen to me. What you've been through doesn't show on your face like a brand. What shows is your strength, your dignity, your courage to keep going when lesser people would have given up." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "How do you know that?" "Because I've spent 4 days watching you put yourself back together one piece at a time. Because I've seen you choose kindness when you had every right to choose bitterness. Because you're sitting here beside me instead of hiding in my barn, and that takes more courage than most people will ever need." As they resumed their journey home, Grace found herself thinking not about Victoria Sterling's suspicious eyes, but about Sheriff Hart's welcoming smile and Henry's friendly greeting. For every person who might judge her, there seemed to be others willing to accept her as she chose to present herself. That evening, as they unpacked their supplies, Grace made a decision that surprised them both. "I think I'd like to go to that Sunday service," she said. Sam looked up from sorting provisions. "You sure about that?" Grace nodded firmly. "I'm tired of hiding, Sam. If I'm going to build a new life, I can't do it from the shadows." Sam smiled, the first truly joyful expression Grace had seen on his weathered face. "Then we'll go together. And if Victoria Sterling wants to judge, she can answer to me." Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the promise of spring still months away. But inside the warm cabin, Grace Morgan was already beginning to bloom, finding in Sam Brooks's steady presence the courage to step back into a world that had tried to break her. She'd been marked as worth $1, but she was learning that her true value couldn't be measured in any currency the world understood. Some things, dignity, courage, the capacity for love, could never be bought or sold, only given freely by those brave enough to recognize their worth. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, with the kind of crystalline beauty that made the Montana peaks look like cathedral spires reaching toward heaven. Grace stood before Sam's small mirror, braiding her hair with hands that trembled slightly despite her determination. She wore her cleanest dress and the blue shawl Sam had found among his late wife's things, a gesture of trust that had made Grace's throat tighten with emotion. "You look fine," Sam said quietly from behind her, and something in his voice made her believe it might be true. The ride to Cedar Falls passed in comfortable silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts about what this day might bring. Grace found herself studying Sam's profile as he guided the horses, noting the way morning light caught the silver in his dark hair, and how his weathered hands held the reins with unconscious competence. Over the past week, she'd begun to see past his careful reserve to the man beneath, someone who'd been hurt as deeply as she had, but had chosen healing over bitterness. She'd caught him watching her sometimes with an expression that made her heart skip in ways she'd thought were broken beyond repair. The small church at the heart of Cedar Falls was already filling when they arrived, families clustering on the steps in their Sunday best, voices carrying warm greetings through the crisp air. Grace felt the familiar tightness in her chest as heads turned toward them, but Sam's steady presence beside her made it bearable. Sheriff Hart approached them with a welcoming smile. "Morning, Sam, Miss Morgan. Beautiful day for worship." "That it is, Sheriff," Sam replied, tipping his hat. "How's Mary feeling?" "Better, thanks. The tonic you brought helped her cough considerably." Hart turned to Grace. "Sam's something of a healer in these parts. Knows more about herb medicine than most doctors." Grace looked at Sam with surprise, filing away this new piece of information about the man who continued to reveal unexpected depths. Before she could comment, Victoria Sterling materialized beside them like an elegant vulture. "How lovely to see you again, Miss Morgan," Victoria said, her voice dripping false sweetness. "I wasn't certain you'd come. Some people find it difficult to face the Lord after living in questionable circumstances." Grace felt Sam tense beside her, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm and answered calmly. "I've found that the Lord tends to judge hearts rather than the circumstances, Mrs. Sterling. And I've always believed that mercy is stronger than judgment." Victoria's eyes flashed with irritation at Grace's composed response. But before she could deliver another barb, the church bell began to ring, calling the congregation to worship. The service itself proved to be a balm for Grace's soul. Reverend Thomas Sterling, Victoria's husband and a man clearly more interested in salvation than scandal, delivered a sermon about second chances and the transformative power of love that seemed to speak directly to her situation. "The Lord doesn't ask us where we've been," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the small sanctuary. "He asks us where we're going, and he offers to walk with us every step of the way." Grace found herself fighting back tears as the congregation sang hymns she remembered from her childhood, before her world had crumbled into darkness and desperation. Sam's deep voice beside her, rough but true, made something inside her chest loosen and expand. But the peace was shattered during the social hour after the service. Grace was helping serve coffee when a commotion erupted near the church's front entrance. A man's voice, loud and slurred with drink, cut through the genteel conversation like a rusty blade. "Where is she? I know she's here." Grace's blood turned to ice. She knew that voice. Marcus Blackwood, the man she'd escaped from 3 weeks ago. Her hands shook so violently that coffee spilled across the table, and she felt the familiar paralysis of terror beginning to claim her. Sam appeared at her side instantly, his presence solid and reassuring. "Easy," he murmured. "You're not alone." Blackwood stumbled into the church hall, his clothes disheveled and his eyes wild with alcohol and fury. He was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with the kind of casual cruelty that enjoyed breaking smaller, weaker things. "There you are, you little bitch," he snarled when he spotted Grace. "Did you think you could just run away from me? I paid good money for you." The church hall fell silent, except for the sound of shocked gasps and children being hurried away by their mothers. Grace stood frozen, transported back to every moment of helplessness she'd endured at this man's hands. But Sam stepped forward, placing himself between Grace and Blackwood, with the kind of lethal calm that made smart men reconsider their choices. "You're drunk, and you're in a house of God," Sam said quietly. "I suggest you leave before you do something you'll regret." Blackwood laughed harshly. "Who the hell are you to tell me anything? That's my property you're harboring." "Miss Morgan isn't anyone's property," Sheriff Hart said, appearing at Sam's shoulder with his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "And you're disturbing the peace." "I've got papers," Blackwood blustered, fumbling in his coat. "Bill of sale, fair and legal." "No such thing as a legal bill of sale for a human being in Montana territory," Hart replied calmly. "Now you can leave peaceful-like, or I can help you leave. Your choice." But Blackwood was beyond reason. Lost in drunken rage and wounded pride, he lunged toward Grace only to find Sam's iron grip closing around his wrist. "I warned you," Sam said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that froze blood in veins. What happened next was swift and decisive. Sam twisted Blackwood's arm behind his back and marched him toward the door with the efficient brutality of someone who'd handled dangerous men before. At the threshold, he leaned close to Blackwood's ear. "If I see you again, if I even hear that you're in this territory, I'll kill you," Sam said quietly, "and I'll take my time doing it." Blackwood stumbled away into the snow, his threats and curses fading as Sheriff Hart escorted him to the town limits with firm instructions never to return. Inside the church hall, Grace stood trembling amid the shocked silence, feeling exposed and ashamed under the weight of so many staring eyes. Victoria Sterling's face wore an expression of vindicated righteousness, as if Grace's past had proven everything she'd suspected. But then something unexpected happened. Mary Hart, the sheriff's wife, approached Grace with a warm smile and took her hands gently. "My dear," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the room, "are you all right? That awful man gave us all quite a fright." One by one, other women began to move forward, not with judgment, but with the protective instinct of mothers and wives who understood what it meant to be vulnerable in a world that didn't always protect its daughters. "That man was a disgrace," declared Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife. "No decent person would speak to a lady that way." "Especially in the Lord's house," added young Mrs. Patterson, bouncing her baby protectively. "Some men have no shame." Victoria Sterling stood apart from the group, her mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. But her voice, when she finally spoke, carried none of its usual venom. "Well," she said stiffly, "I suppose we all have things in our past we'd rather forget." It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't condemnation either. Grace nodded gratefully, understanding that this was as close to acceptance as she was likely to get from Cedar Falls' self-appointed moral guardian. Sam returned to the hall as the crowd began to disperse, his face still hard with controlled anger. He approached Grace carefully, as if she might shatter at the wrong word. "You all right?" he asked softly. Grace nodded, though her hands were still shaking. "He's gone. Sheriff Hart's making sure he keeps going. Won't be back." Sam's voice carried absolute certainty. "But Grace, folks heard what he said. They know now." Grace looked around the hall at the faces of people she'd hoped to build relationships with. Some showed sympathy, others curiosity. A few displayed the careful neutrality of those who preferred not to get involved in other people's complications. "I know," she said quietly. "I knew this day would come eventually." Reverend Sterling approached them, his face grave but kind. "Miss Morgan, I want you to know that what happened here today doesn't change anything. You're welcome in this church, in this community, for as long as you choose to stay." "Thank you, Reverend," Grace whispered, tears finally spilling over. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Hart pulled Sam aside for a quiet conversation that Grace couldn't hear, but could read in their serious expressions. When Sam returned to her side, his jaw was set with determination. The ride home passed in heavy silence, both of them processing what had happened and what it might mean for their fragile peace. Grace stared out at the familiar landscape, the snow-covered fields, the distant mountains, the homestead that had become her sanctuary, and wondered if she'd brought too much danger into Sam's quiet life. "I should leave," she said suddenly as they pulled into the barnyard. Sam brought the wagon to a stop and turned to face her fully. "Why?" "Because that won't be the last of it. Men like Blackwood don't give up easy, and now everyone in town knows who I am, what I've been. It'll only bring you trouble." Sam was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her heart race. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and deliberate. "Grace, I've been alone for 8 years. 8 years of waking up to empty rooms and going to bed with nothing but ghosts for company. These past 2 weeks with you here, it's the first time I've felt like I was living instead of just surviving." Grace's breath caught in her throat. "Sam, I'm not saying this to pressure you or make you feel obligated. I'm saying it because you need to know that whatever trouble comes, we'll face it together. If you want to." Grace looked into his weathered face, seeing past the careful reserve to the lonely man beneath. For 8 years, they'd both been running from different kinds of pain. But somewhere in the space between her desperate need for safety and his quiet offer of shelter, something beautiful had taken root. "I want to," she whispered. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing coffee in comfortable silence, Grace made a decision that surprised them both. "I want to tell you," she said quietly, "about what happened to me. All of it." Sam set down his cup and gave her his full attention, his expression patient and non-judgmental. Grace began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper at first, then growing stronger as the words found their way out. She told him about her father's gambling debts, about being sold at 15 to pay what he owed. She described the succession of men who'd bought and used her, each one taking a little more of her spirit until she'd almost forgotten she was human. She told him about Marcus Blackwood's cruelty, about the cellar where he'd kept her chained, about the night she'd finally found the courage to run. And through it all, Sam listened without judgment, his presence steady and reassuring. When she finished, tears streaming down her face, Sam reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand gently. "Thank you," he said simply, "for trusting me with that." "Aren't you disgusted?" Grace asked, her voice breaking. "Knowing what I've been, what I've done?" Sam's grip on her hand tightened. "Grace, listen to me. What was done to you, that's not who you are. You're not defined by other people's cruelty. You're defined by your own courage, your own choices, your own heart." Grace looked into his eyes and saw nothing but truth and acceptance. For the first time since she was 15 years old, she felt truly seen, not as property or victim, but as Grace Morgan, a woman with her own strength and dignity. "I love you," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Sam's breath caught, and for a moment they sat in stunned silence. Then he smiled, the first truly radiant expression Grace had ever seen on his weathered face. "I love you too," he said simply. "Have since the day I found you in my barn, if I'm being honest." They sat holding hands as the fire burned low, both of them marveling at how love could grow in the most unlikely soil. Outside, the Montana winds sang through the pines, but inside the warm cabin, two damaged souls had found something worth fighting for. The confrontation with Blackwood had forced them to face the reality that their peace was fragile, that the outside world would always try to define Grace by her past. But it had also shown them something else, that love, real love, was stronger than shame or fear or the cruel judgment of those who'd never known true hardship. As they prepared for bed that night, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in over a decade: hope for the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't face them alone. She had Sam, and Sam had her, and that was enough to build a life on. Spring came late that year, as if winter couldn't quite let go of its hold on the Montana peaks. But when it finally arrived in earnest, it brought with it a sense of renewal that seemed to echo the transformation taking place in Grace Morgan's heart. She'd spent the last month working alongside Sam to prepare the ranch for the growing season, and with each fence mended and each field cleared, she felt more rooted in this life they were building together. The townspeople of Cedar Falls had mostly adjusted to her presence, treating her with the cautious respect they might show any woman who'd proven she belonged. Victoria Sterling still maintained her frosty disapproval, but even she had stopped making pointed comments about propriety and redemption. It was on a warm May morning, with wildflowers beginning to bloom in the meadows, that the trouble Sam had been expecting finally arrived. Grace was hanging laundry when she spotted the dust cloud on the southern horizon. 3 riders approaching fast, and something about their purposeful movement made her stomach clench with familiar dread. She called out to Sam, who was repairing the corral fence, and watched his expression darken as he shaded his eyes against the sun. "Get inside," he said quietly, reaching for the rifle he always kept nearby. "Stay away from the windows." But Grace had spent too many years being moved around like a chess piece in other people's games. "No," she said firmly. "Whatever this is, we face it together." The riders pulled up in the barnyard with the swagger of men accustomed to taking what they wanted. Their leader was a thin, sharp-faced man in an expensive suit that looked out of place in ranch country. The two with him were obviously hired muscle, the kind of men who settled disputes with fists and bullets rather than words. "You Samuel Brooks," the leader called out, not bothering to dismount. "I am," Sam replied, his voice carrying the kind of calm that made smart men nervous. "You're on my land without invitation." The man smiled coldly and pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I'm Thomas Hartwell, attorney at law. I represent the interests of Mr. Marcus Blackwood, who has legitimate claim to property currently being harbored on these premises." Grace felt her blood turn to ice at Blackwood's name, but she forced herself to stand straight beside Sam, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. Miss Morgan isn't property, Sam said evenly, and Blackwood isn't welcome here. I'm afraid that's not your decision to make, Hartwell replied smoothly. Mr. Blackwood has documentation proving his legal ownership of the woman, a bill of sale, properly witnessed and recorded. No such thing as legal slavery in Montana territory, Sam countered. Hartwell's smile widened. Ah, but Miss Morgan wasn't purchased as a slave. She was bought as payment for debt, a recognized legal transaction under territorial law when properly documented. And I assure you, Mr. Brooks, our documentation is impeccable. Grace found her voice, though it trembled with suppressed fear. I never agreed to be sold. My father had no right. Your father was legally responsible for your disposition as an unmarried minor, Hartwell interrupted. The transaction was entirely legitimate. You're coming with us, Miss Morgan, whether you choose to or not. That's when Sam stepped forward, and something in his movement made all three men reach for their weapons. But Sam's hands remained empty, though his voice carried the promise of violence. She's not going anywhere, he said quietly. Hartwell laughed. Mr. Brooks, I admire your gallantry, but you're outnumbered and outgunned. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Actually, came a new voice from behind them, I'd say the odds just evened up considerable. Sheriff Hart emerged from the barn where he'd been waiting, his rifle trained on the mounted men. Behind him came three of Cedar Falls' most respected citizens, Henry from the general store, Doc Morrison, and Frank Patterson from the bank, all armed and looking grimly determined. Hartwell's confidence faltered as he realized the trap he'd ridden into. This is illegal interference with lawful business, Sheriff? This is protection of a citizen, Hart replied calmly. Miss Morgan is under the protection of Montana law, which doesn't recognize the kind of documentation you're waving around. We'll see what the territorial judge says about that, Hartwell snarled. Funny thing, Hart continued conversationally. I sent a telegram to Judge Morrison last week about this very situation. Got his reply yesterday. Seems he's very interested in meeting with you gentlemen about forged legal documents and attempted kidnapping. The two hired gunmen began to fidget nervously, clearly having second thoughts about their employer's assurances of legal protection. Hartwell's face had gone pale beneath his carefully groomed whiskers. You can't prove— Actually, we can, interrupted a new voice. Marcus Blackwood himself rode into the yard, flanked by two more armed men, but instead of the confident predator Grace remembered, he looked haggard and desperate, like a man whose world was falling apart around him. Blackwood, Sam said, his voice like winter wind. I told you what would happen if I saw you again. You told me a lot of things, Blackwood replied, trying to summon his old arrogance. But you're not the only one with friends in this territory. He gestured toward his companions, and Grace recognized them with a chill. Bounty hunters, the kind of men who tracked runaway slaves for profit and didn't much care about the legal niceties. But Sheriff Hart had been expecting this too. At his signal, more men emerged from concealment around the ranch buildings, ranchers and townsmen who'd ridden out from Cedar Falls to make a stand. Within moments, Blackwood's small force was outnumbered 2-1. Here's what's going to happen, Hart said, his voice carrying absolute authority. You gentlemen are going to mount up and ride out of this territory. If I see any of you again, I'll arrest you for conspiracy to commit kidnapping. She belongs to me, Blackwood shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. I paid for her. She's mine. No, Grace said, stepping forward with a courage that surprised everyone, including herself. I belong to me. I always have, even when I forgot it for a while. She looked directly at Blackwood, and for the first time since she'd escaped his cellar, she felt no fear when she met his eyes. You never owned me, Marcus. You rented my body and tried to break my spirit, but you never owned the part of me that mattered, and now even that rental agreement is over. Blackwood started to spur his horse forward, rage overcoming what little sense he had left. But Sam was there, his hand closing around the horse's bridle with a grip that brought the animal to a sudden stop. She told you to leave, Sam said quietly. I suggest you listen. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the space of years and different kinds of pain. Then Blackwood's shoulders sagged in defeat, and he seemed to age a decade in as many seconds. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Sheriff Hart replied firmly. "Judge Morrison's issued warrants for your arrest on multiple charges. You've got a day's head start to get out of the territory. After that, every lawman from here to California will be looking for you." As the defeated men rode away, Grace felt something inside her chest loosen and expand. The shadow that had followed her for so many years was finally gone, banished not by her own strength alone, but by the collective will of people who'd chosen to see her as worth defending. Sam's arm came around her shoulders, solid and warm and reassuring. "It's over," he said quietly. Grace leaned into his embrace, watching until the dust cloud disappeared over the southern ridge. "Yes," she whispered, "it really is." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Sam reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. "Grace," he said, his voice unusually uncertain, "I know we haven't talked about making this permanent, but after today, after everything—" He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band, worn but beautiful, catching the last rays of sunlight like captured hope. "It was my mother's," he said, "and before that, my grandmother's. I was saving it for Sarah, but she never got to wear it." Grace stared at the ring, her heart pounding so hard she was sure Sam could hear it. "I'm not asking because of what happened today," Sam continued. "I'm asking because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Because you've made me remember what it feels like to be alive instead of just surviving." He looked up at her, his gray eyes vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. "Grace Morgan, will you marry me?" Grace felt tears streaming down her face as she nodded, unable to speak past the joy that had lodged in her throat like a bright, warm stone. Sam slipped the ring onto her finger, with hands that shook slightly, and Grace marveled at how something so simple could feel like the most important moment of her entire life. "I love you," she whispered when she finally found her voice. "I love you too," Sam replied, pulling her close. "Forever." As the stars began to appear overhead, Grace realized that her journey from that barn to this moment had been more than just physical distance traveled. She'd found her way from fear to courage, from shame to dignity, from isolation to love. The woman who'd worn a dollar price tag was gone, replaced by Grace Brooks, soon to be officially, but already in every way that mattered. She was no longer something to be bought or sold, but someone to be cherished and protected and loved. And that, she thought, as Sam's arms tightened around her, was worth more than all the money in the world. The wedding took place on a golden September morning when the aspen trees had turned to living fire, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter still months away. Grace stood before the mirror in Mary Hart's bedroom, wearing a dress that had once belonged to Sam's late wife, altered to fit her smaller frame, but transformed with new lace and tiny pearl buttons that caught the morning light like scattered stars. "You look beautiful, dear," Mary said softly, adjusting the simple veil that had been her own mother's. "Sam's a lucky man." Grace touched the ring on her finger, Sam's mother's ring that had become her engagement band, and marveled at how much her life had changed since that frozen February morning when she'd sought shelter in a stranger's barn. The entire population of Cedar Falls seemed to have gathered at the small church, along with ranchers and homesteaders from 50 miles around. Word had spread about the woman who'd found love after escaping slavery, and the community had embraced her story as proof that redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to claim it. Even Victoria Sterling had unbent enough to contribute a cake to the reception, though she still maintained her reserve around Grace. Some changes, Grace had learned, came slowly or not at all, and she'd made peace with the fact that not everyone would accept her completely. As Grace walked down the aisle on Sheriff Hart's arm, he'd insisted on the honor after her own father had long since disappeared into whatever hole bad men crawled into. She saw Sam waiting at the altar and felt her heart skip with the same flutter of possibility she'd experienced that first morning when he'd offered her coffee and kindness without asking for anything in return. Sam wore his best suit, his dark hair freshly trimmed, and his weathered face transformed by a smile that reached all the way to his gray eyes. He looked like a man who'd found his way home after years of wandering, and Grace realized she was seeing her own transformation reflected in his face. Reverend Sterling performed the ceremony with genuine warmth, speaking about second chances and the transformative power of love with the conviction of someone who'd seen both grace and judgment in action. When it came time for vows, Sam's voice was steady but filled with emotion. Grace, you came to me broken, and somehow in healing you, I healed myself. I promise to protect you, to cherish you, to see you as the remarkable woman you are every day for the rest of my life. Grace's voice trembled as she spoke her own vows. Sam, you saw me when I couldn't see myself. You offered me shelter and gave me a home. I promise to love you, to stand beside you, to build a life with you that honors what we've both survived. When Reverend Sterling pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation erupted in cheers that seemed to echo off the mountains themselves. Sam's kiss was gentle and reverent, sealing a promise that had been building between them since that first cup of coffee shared in desperate circumstances. The reception that followed was the kind of community celebration that small towns did best. Tables groaning under the weight of contributed dishes, children running between the adults' legs, and music that lasted until the stars came out. Grace found herself surrounded by women who'd become her friends, their acceptance complete and ungrudging. You've made him happy in a way we never thought we'd see again, Doc Morrison told her during one of the dances. Sarah's death nearly killed him, but you've brought him back to life. Grace looked across the room at her husband, the words still felt miraculous on her tongue, who was deep in conversation with a group of ranchers about cattle prices and weather patterns. He caught her eye and smiled, and she felt the familiar flutter of joy that his attention always brought. As the evening wound down and the guests began to drift away with promises to visit soon, Sam and Grace found themselves alone on the church steps, looking out at the star-filled Montana sky. No regrets? Sam asked, taking her hand. Only that it took me so long to find you, Grace replied, leaning into his warmth. They drove home through moonlight that turned the familiar landscape into something magical and new. The homestead that had been Sam's refuge and Grace's sanctuary was now truly theirs. A place where two damaged souls had learned to trust again, to love again, to believe in the possibility of happiness. Over the following months, Grace threw herself into the business of building a life worth living. She expanded the kitchen garden, learned to preserve the harvest, and took over the ranch's financial records with the careful attention to detail that years of uncertainty had taught her. Sam watched his wife bloom like a flower finally planted in good soil. The fearful, broken woman he'd found in his barn was still there somewhere. But she'd been joined by someone stronger, a woman who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to claim her place in the world. Winter came early that year, but it brought no hardship to the Brooks homestead. Grace had spent the autumn months preparing for the cold with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned never to take comfort for granted. The root cellar was full, the firewood stacked high, and the house made ready for whatever storms might come. On a snowy January evening, as they sat by the fire sharing coffee and comfortable silence, Grace made an announcement that transformed Sam's face with wonder. I think we're going to need to add on to the house, she said quietly, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. Sam's cup clattered against the saucer as understanding dawned. Grace, are you? She nodded, tears of joy streaming down her face. Dr. Morrison confirmed it yesterday. The baby should come in late summer. Sam crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around the small cabin while she laughed with pure delight. When he set her down, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I never thought, he began, then stopped, overcome by emotion. I know, Grace said softly. Neither did I. But maybe that's how the best miracles work. They come when you've stopped believing they're possible. They spent the rest of the evening making plans for the addition, discussing cribs and names and all the ordinary, extraordinary details of the life they were creating together. Grace fell asleep that night with Sam's hand resting protectively over the place where their child grew, feeling safer and more loved than she'd ever dreamed possible. Spring brought not just the baby's approaching arrival, but also the final resolution of Grace's past. Word reached Cedar Falls that Marcus Blackwood had been killed in a bar fight in California, dying as violently and meaninglessly as he'd lived. Grace felt no joy at the news, only a quiet sense of closure. The last shadow from her former life had finally been laid to rest. On a warm August morning, with the assistance of Dr. Morrison and Mary Hart, Grace gave birth to a daughter with Sam's gray eyes and her own stubborn chin. They named her Sarah Hope Brooks, Sarah for the woman whose memory had brought them together, Hope for the future they were building. As Grace held her daughter for the first time, feeling Sam's strong arms around them both, she marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who'd been marked with a dollar price tag had become someone's wife, someone's mother, someone precious beyond measure. "She's perfect," Sam whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he traced their daughter's tiny fingers with one gentle fingertip. "She's ours," Grace corrected, and in that simple word was everything she'd learned about the difference between being owned and being loved, between being property and being family. Years passed in the rhythm of seasons and the small joys of daily life. Grace became known throughout the territory as a woman of strength and compassion, someone who could be counted on to help neighbor families through hard times and celebrate with them during good ones. Sam expanded the ranch, taking on partners and hiring hands who respected both his skill and his wife's wisdom. The Brooks homestead became a stopping place for travelers, known for its warm hospitality and the obvious love between its owners. Sarah Hope grew into a bright, confident child who knew nothing of shame or fear, only the security of being deeply loved. Grace watched her daughter play in the same barnyard where she'd once hidden in desperate fear, and marveled at how completely her world had been transformed. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Sam presented Grace with a leather-bound journal filled with his careful handwriting, the story of their life together, from that first morning in the barn to their present happiness. "I wanted her to know," he said, nodding towards Sarah Hope, who was chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk, "when she's old enough to understand. I wanted her to know how brave her mother was, how she chose love over fear and built something beautiful from nothing." Grace opened the journal and read the first lines. "She came to me broken, carrying nothing but shame and a price tag that said she was worth $1. But Grace Morgan was worth everything. My heart, my future, my very soul. This is the story of how we saved each other." Tears blurred Grace's vision as she read her husband's account of their love story, seeing their journey through his eyes and marveling at the man who'd seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling him close, as Sarah Hope's laughter echoed across the meadow. "Thank you," Sam replied, "for teaching me that love is stronger than loneliness, hope is stronger than despair, and that broken things can still be beautiful." As the stars came out over the Montana mountains, Grace Brooks looked around at the life she'd built from nothing but courage and one man's kindness. She thought about the woman she'd been, frightened, ashamed, convinced she was worthless, and marveled at the distance traveled. Love had made the difference. Not just Sam's love for her, but her own slowly growing love for herself. The courage to believe she deserved happiness. The strength to fight for the life she wanted instead of accepting the one forced upon her. The price tag was long gone, buried somewhere in the past where it belonged. In its place was something far more valuable. The knowledge that her worth had never been determined by other people's cruelty, but by her own heart, her own choices, her own capacity for love and forgiveness. Grace Brooks was priceless, and she'd finally learned to believe it. 25 years later, visitors to Cedar Falls would often ask about the distinguished woman who ran the territory's most successful ranch alongside her silver-haired husband. Local folks would smile and tell them about Grace Brooks, how she'd arrived during a blizzard with nothing but the clothes on her back and had built an empire of love and prosperity through sheer determination and the support of a good man. They might mention her work establishing the territory's first school for girls, ensuring that no young woman would ever face the world without education and options. They'd speak of her reputation as a healer and midwife, how she'd helped birth half the children in 3 counties and had never lost a mother on her watch. But the story they loved most was the love story itself, how Sam and Grace Brooks had found each other in the wilderness and proved that broken hearts could heal, that damaged souls could love, and that the most beautiful families were sometimes built from the pieces of shattered lives. Sarah Hope Brooks grew up to become a teacher, and eventually the territory's first female judge, carrying forward her mother's belief that every person deserved dignity and justice regardless of their past. She married a doctor from back east and gave Grace and Sam 6 grandchildren who filled the expanded ranch house with laughter and chaos. Grace lived to be 73, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew her only as the strongest, kindest woman they'd ever met. Sam followed her just 2 years later, unable to imagine a world without his Grace in it. They were buried side by side on the hill overlooking the ranch, beneath matching headstones that bore a simple inscription. They saw the best in each other and brought out the best in everyone they met. The ranch house still stands today, preserved as a historical site that tells the story of the Montana Territory's early days. But for those who know the real history, it represents something more. Proof that love can triumph over cruelty, that kindness can heal the deepest wounds, and that every person, no matter how broken they may seem, carries within them the potential for remarkable transformation. The price tag that once defined Grace Morgan as worth $1 sits in a display case in the Territory's Historical Museum. Not as a reminder of shame, but as evidence of how wrong the world can be about a person's true value. Beside it sits Grace's wedding ring and a photograph of the Brooks family at their last Christmas together. 3 generations gathered around a table laden with love and laughter. Visitors often comment on Grace's eyes in that photograph, how they shine with the confident joy of a woman who knows exactly who she is and what she's worth. There's no trace of the fear and shame that once defined her, only the radiant happiness of someone who'd learned to love herself as much as others loved her. The story of Grace and Sam Brooks became legend throughout the American West, told around campfires and in parlors wherever people gathered to share tales of love conquering adversity. But perhaps the most important legacy they left wasn't the ranch or the businesses or even the family they built together. Their greatest gift to the world was the proof they offered that redemption is always possible, that love can heal any wound, and that every person, no matter how the world has treated them, deserves the chance to write their own ending. Grace Brooks learned that her worth was never determined by other people's cruelty, but by her own courage to claim the love she deserved. Her story reminds us that sometimes the most beautiful transformations begin with the simplest acts of human kindness. A warm cup of coffee, a safe place to sleep, and someone brave enough to see the person behind the pain. What would you do if you found someone broken and desperate seeking shelter? Have you ever had your true worth recognized by someone who saw past your circumstances to your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from. Because stories like Grace and Sam's prove that love and second chances can happen anywhere, anytime, to anyone brave enough to believe they deserve them. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories of love, courage, and the transformative power of human kindness. Because the best stories aren't just about the characters we meet, they're about recognizing the hero in yourself and the power we all have to change someone's life with a single act of compassion.